The most dangerous weapon of World War II wasn't always a gun. Sometimes it was a seed, a quiet, stubborn, soil-healing seed that could grow food where bombs had stripped the earth raw. In the first 10 seconds of this story, here's the shocker. During World War II, entire farming systems were rebuilt around one kind of plant that fed itself, rebuilt dead soil, and slashed fertilizer use almost to zero. When war broke the soil. World War II didn't just burn cities, it broke farmland. Tanks compacted fields into concrete, shelling shredded topsoil, chemical runoff from explosives and fuel-poisoned acres. Europe and parts of Asia were facing something more terrifying than rationing. They were facing agricultural collapse. At the same time, synthetic fertilizer factories were being redirected to make explosives. Nitrates that once fed wheat were now feeding artillery. Farmers couldn't rely on industrial fertilizer even if they wanted to. So wartime agricultural scientists turned back to something ancient, biological fertility. They needed a plant that could grow fast, protect bare ground, feed animals and humans, and most importantly, make its own fertilizer. They found it in nitrogen-fixing plants. The plant that made its own fertilizer. The so-called forever plant wasn't a single secret species locked in a lab. It was a family of plants, legumes, crops like clover, alfalfa, field peas and vetch. Plants humans had used for thousands of years before factories ever existed. What made them different is almost unbelievable. These plants partner with bacteria in their roots. The bacteria pull nitrogen straight out of the air and convert it into a form plants can use. Free fertilizer, built underground, day and night. In wartime manuals, these plants were called green manure. Farmers planted them not to harvest them, but to plough them back into the soil. 1 acre of clover could add over 100 kilograms of nitrogen back into exhausted land in a single season. That's the equivalent of tons of industrial fertilizer. Without factories, without imports, without money. And it didn't stop there. Their deep roots broke compacted soil left by military vehicles. They pulled minerals back up from layers other crops couldn't reach. They protected fields from erosion. They fed livestock. They rebuilt dead farmland faster than any chemical program ever could. In war conditions, this wasn't gardening. This was survival infrastructure. You know, it's quite remarkable how the Second World War quietly ran on green plants. Across wartime Europe, the United Kingdom and North America, governments actually launched these massive soil restoration campaigns. Fields were rotated, and I mean aggressively, with clover and alfalfa. Damaged farmland, well, it was seeded not with food crops at first, but with nitrogen fixers to heal it. Victory garden manuals. They told civilians to plant legumes between rows of vegetables. Not for looks, mind you, for fertility. The plants fed the soil while people, well, they fed themselves. Military planners understood something most modern people never hear. Wars aren't won only by weapons. They're won by calories. And calories, well, they come from dirt. By 1944, some regions had cut synthetic fertilizer use dramatically. Yields didn't crash. In fact, in many places they rose. Soil that had been bombed and starved was producing again. naturally. This system was cheap, local, renewable, resilient, and that made it dangerous. When the war ended, factories didn't shut down. They rebranded. Explosives plants became fertilizer plants, and those nitrate pipelines that once fed bombs were now feeding bags of bright white pellets. Governments really pushed industrial agriculture hard. Monocultures, tractors, chemicals, speed. Green manure farming didn't fit this new vision. It couldn't be patented, and, it couldn't be sold in sacks. It required patience, planning, rotation, knowledge. Chemical fertilizer was instant. Just spread it, forget it. Plant the same crop year after year. No messy cover crops, no waiting for soil to heal. So, the story changed. Legumes were no longer the heroes of soil recovery. They became old-fashioned, slow, inefficient. Something your grandfather did, really. Agricultural textbooks were rewritten. Wartime research was shelved. Funding flowed into chemistry instead of biology. And within a generation, most farmers were taught that soil fertility came from factories, not roots. The forever plant wasn't banned. It was ignored. Now, here's the part, that most history channels never touch. Nitrogen-fixing systems, they actually threaten dependency. They break that old cycle of buying fertility every single season. Instead, they empower local food systems, right where people live. They rebuild the soil, rather than just mining it year after year. By the 1960s, global agriculture had, pretty much locked itself into what you'd call an input model. Seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, fuel, all of it purchased, all of it recurring year after year. But the system during the war, it pointed in the opposite direction. Really. Closed loops, regeneration, land that could feed itself. It's, hard to build a trillion-dollar industry on something farmers can just grow for free. So the forever plant, it faded into the footnotes. Mentioned in textbooks, sure, but rarely emphasized. Almost never dramatized. Even though, wartime harvest records show exactly how effective it was. This wasn't just superstition. No, it was applied biological engineering. Why this matters to wartime history? World War II is usually told through battles and generals. But beneath every front line was a back line of farmers fighting a quieter war, against erosion, against nutrient collapse, against hunger. Legume fields were, as strategic as fuel depots. Without them, much of Europe's soil recovery would have taken decades longer, Livestock numbers would have collapsed. Civilian food shortages would have been worse, that's for certain. Military logistics would have suffered too. The forever plant didn't win headlines. It won harvests. This story isn't just about plants. It's about what societies choose to remember, really. Wartime governments proved you could rebuild agriculture without chemical dependency. They proved soil could heal itself when biology was allowed to work. They proved resilience beats speed when systems are under pressure. And then they chose a different road. Not because it was stronger, because it was more profitable. The forever plant still exists. It grows on roadsides, in forgotten fields, in old farming systems that never fully disappeared. But its role in saving wartime agriculture has been largely erased from public memory, which is, well, why we tell it here. If this changed how you see World War II even a little, you're exactly the kind of mind this channel is for. Life in wartime. WWII exists to uncover the hidden systems behind the battles, the food, the soil, the survival science that kept nations alive. Subscribe so you don't miss what history textbooks skip. Share this with someone who thinks wars are only won with weapons. And as always, stay curious. Because sometimes the most powerful tools in war weren't forged in fire. They were grown